I'm International Master William Paschall, and this is the Blumenfeld Gambit, a modern repertoire. This is part one of my series, an historical perspective on this defense which begins after the moves d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, c5, and now d5. The position can be reached by slightly different move orders, but this is the most common. Now black plays the gambit move b5. b5 initiates what we call the Blumenfeld Gambit. The history of this opening is a little bit mysterious. It is named after the Russian master Benjamin Blumenfeld, but any games that he's played in this opening remain elusive. Of his recorded games, there are no references to this opening directly. This master was a particularly interesting player, playing very aggressive and kind of risky modern things, such as the Scandinavian with knight to f6. Clearly a gambit-style player. The first really famous game that we can connect to Blumenfeld, perhaps, would be with the support of Alexander Alekhine, who played against Tarrasch in Bad Pistian in 1922. Now, the naming of the opening as the Blumenfeld Gambit is not clear. I would assume that Alekhine's use of the opening could have had something to do with it. He could have referenced Blumenfeld. Perhaps Alekhine himself got the defense from Blumenfeld, or had heard of it being played by Blumenfeld. There's a number of games where the opening suddenly appears in 1922. The first of these, and the most famous of them, is the game I'm going to show you between Siegbert Tarrasch and Alexander Alekhine, the only Russian among the players who played this in 1922. So it's possible that the connection there, with Alekhine playing it, perhaps getting it from the past, having been played in maybe casual or unrecorded games or lost games by Benjamin Blumenfeld. The opening took off rather quickly in 1922, being played not only in the game by Alekhine, but also by Bogolyubov, a second Russian master, Maratsi, Rudolf Spielmann, and so the opening was basically born into top circles in 1922. Alekhine would later take this opening with him in his travels to South America, where it seems that the Blumenfeld caught on quite a bit. There are a lot of references to games in South America and Argentina where Alekhine traveled. In the 30s, the opening was quite popular there. And then continuing to grow a little bit in Europe in the 40s. Eventually, having been played by Maratsi, there was a kind of Hungarian component to this growth of this opening, and it was played after Maratsi by other later Hungarian masters like Arpad Elo and Florian, and later finally by Laszlo Szabo, who has at least one recorded game, the great Hungarian master Laszlo Szabo. So at that point it becomes almost like an accepted mainstream opening in the 40s, and finally I think reaching its modern development about the mid to late 50s, when the first relatively modern grandmaster really picked it up on a regular basis, the great Lajos Portis. So there really are several elements to its growth. First of all, its birth with Russian masters, being played by Alekhine, brought to mainland sort of Europe, played in these famous games, a bunch of famous games in 1922, and then it spread out as Alekhine took it to South America, and then it continued to grow in Europe, and as I said, began to be popular with the Hungarian masters, and then it sort of spread all over the world. So we're going to take a look at some of the historical games where it was played in these first titanic battles in 1922. The gambit idea, in its accepted form, again popularized very importantly by being played by Alekhine, Maratsi, and Bogalyubov and Rudolf Spielmann, who Spielmann of those players probably played it the most in numerous games over his career. Now, in this particular game, we're looking at Tarrasch against Alekhine, which is 1922 Bad Pistian. Tarrasch, faced with an aggressive gambit, which may have been new to him at that time, he decides to accept the gambit, which is still today one of the two primary continuations for white. D takes e6. White forces black to perhaps weaken his king position a tiny bit here. F takes e. But more importantly, black increases his central preponderance of pawns, and that's really one of the most formative ideas. In the accepted version, as we see here in Tarrasch versus Alekhine, black's central pawn majority, the central pawns e6, d7, c5, outnumbering the white central pawns at e2, this c pawn here on c4, likely going to capture on b5. As we see, c takes b5. Now, the classical way of playing this position is still valid today. I'm going to recommend two ways as we go forward into the series for black to play, at least two ways for black to play against the accepted version of the gambit, but Alekhine naturally playing the classical method here where black occupies the center with his strong pawns. So d5, black hopes to gain control eventually of e5 as well, when he will be able to advance in the center and take full advantage of the center. White, of course, should be able to meet that with e4 at some key moment. Otherwise, black will overrun white, as is the case in this game. So again, Tarrasch versus Alekhine. This is Bad Pistian 1922. e3, bishop to d6. Now, knight to c3. This move is interesting, but it can also be attacked by the forward-moving black center. White is attempting to fight for control of the e4 square, which is very vital. He may need to play e4 himself at some point to kind of blockade the advancing black center. But again, putting the knight on c3 entails allowing situations where the pieces can be driven back by the black pawns, perhaps d4 at some moment. Castles, and now bishop e2. This is a relatively natural but passive formation for white. In later parts of the series, we'll look at modern theory and perhaps the ability for white to play something else, like a fianchetto setup on the king side, which is always a little bit more solid. The king side being protected by the fianchetto bishop and the pawn formation h2, g3, f2. So Alekhine, bishop b7, and now b3 in this position. Black has to attack the white king. White has to worry about completing his development. And Tarrasch senses that black could have very strong kingside attacks, so he's not in a hurry to castle right away, electing to develop the rest of his pieces naturally. b3, knight on bd7, bishop to b2. And now we reach a point where both sides have to think about how to develop the rest of their pieces. So I think for black it's a little bit easier. He has more space due to the central pawns. Therefore he has more options and more squares for his pieces. Alekhine here finding a way to develop the queen, also defend the bishop on d6. Because of white's possible idea to play e4 in this position, and the queen attacking the bishop at d6. Alekhine here defending his bishop on d6. Now castles, and still more preparation from black. Basically, he could play e5 at this point. I don't think there's anything drastically wrong with it, but white will have some opportunities to play if e5, e4. Even if it means sacrificing a pawn, we have to consider it for white. First, rook on a to d8. Developing the last piece, you might say. This also allows for black to consider the retreat of the bishop back to b8 without boxing his rook out on a8. Now queen c2, and I think white's set up at this point a little bit slow. As we'll see here, e5, Alekhine not messing around anymore. And if white cannot meet e5 with e4 in order to blockade the position, I think in this case it would be interesting. Sacrificing a pawn might allow black's attack to be too strong. So Tarash here allowing white to kind of be pushed back. Rook on f to e1. This is very bad and very passive, but he wants to bring the knight back to d2 and to f1. The problem is that f2 is a weakness, and I think it's kind of a fatal one here for white. He basically can't make this extravagant maneuver and keep f2 protected at the same time. Alekhine will pounce on the f2 square eventually. e4, overrunning white. Knight to d2, and now knight to e5. Very, very natural, the way that all of Alekhine's pieces here will play. Even the bishop on b7 has potential along the long diagonal if things were to open up. All the black pieces working. Knight d1. This is very passive, but the only way to protect f2. Knight on f to g4. Bishop takes g4. Knight takes g4. And now the aforementioned knight f1. White barely protecting everything. h2, f2. Queen g5, increasing the threats. h3, weakening the king side. Then knight h6 in black simply pirouettes around, bringing the knight to f5, potentially h4. The g2 square, a massive weakness in white's position here. King h1. Now the weakness of white's position felt because he's had to give up his white squared bishop. Really, the kingside attack here for black is just overwhelming and very natural. Knight f5, knight h2, and then d4. This is beautiful because it really allows black to bring the last piece into effect in the game, that bishop on b7. And Tarash goes completely passive, trying to hold his position together, allowing black a transfer of advantages, you might say, going from direct attack to massively powerful protected pass pawn here with d3. Queen c4 check, king h8. When playing the black side of the Blumenfeld in these lines, you have to be constantly aware about the safety of your king, because playing f takes e in the opening will open up the king side. Moves like king h8 might be necessary precautions at some point. Bishop b2, and now a beautiful combination, knight to g3 check. You cannot take, the threats are too strong. If pawn takes knight, queen takes on g3, and if the knight moves, it will be easily displaced with the rook sacrifice on f1 or the move h5. So king g1, and then a beautiful move here, bishop d5, forcing white back, queen a4. The queen is completely out of play, and white made to look really like an amateur here, but against a strong player of Alekhine's magnitude, a slight inferiority out of the opening like this for white is a fatal mistake. Knight e2 check, king h1, and then it's just a gradual build-up, rook f7, queen a6, and then he actually advances the h-pawn here too. b6, and then again this combination, knight to g3 check, king g1, he simply takes on b6, queen takes b6, and now d2. The secondary advantage traps the rook at e1, which is very beautiful. Rook f1, we win the exchange, knight takes f1, knight takes f1, and the rest, as they say, is a matter of technique. Alekhine winning easily here against Tarash. Bishop e6, king h1, and then the flashy combination, bishop takes h3. And the white king is caught in what is essentially a mating net. Takes, rook f3, knight to g3, and h4. Alekhine using everything at his disposal to execute the attack. Even the h-pawn. Bishop f6, a desperate move. Queen takes f6, knight takes e4, and then rook takes h3 check when white is simply losing. White resigns here the black attack, overwhelming, mate ensuing in this position. No way for white to escape the attacking black pieces. Alekhine wins. Our next example historical game is the battle Ernst Grunfeld against Bogolyubov. This was played in Vienna, 1922. So we have another very strong top Russian player playing in Vienna, 1922. This is the area where the opening was really popularized in this generation. Before Alekhine would take it to Argentina, it would later be played by Marazzi and be spread amongst the Hungarian players, I think. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, c5, d5, b5. We're going to look for a second here at bishop g5. This is kind of a tale of caution. This game is a win for white that we're going to examine, the battle between Grunfeld and Bogolyubov. You have to realize that the Blumenfeld is a dangerous opening. It's extremely aggressive. It can backfire if you make one mistake. It's kind of a high-risk, high-reward opening. Bishop g5 is the move that became the main line after the opening was first really discovered. Players slowly realized they didn't want to give the initiative by accepting the gambit pawn, and they looked for other paths. And bishop g5 makes a lot of sense. White stakes out early territory with the move d5 in the opening. A spatial gain is very important, as in the Benoni. Bishop g5 fights for the control of d5, and I think in that respect it almost reminds you of an e4 opening, how the d5 point is so really vital. But again, also seen in the Benoni. It's a close relative of the Benoni and the Blumenfeld Gambit, obviously. But with bishop g5, white is in many cases willing to give up the dark squared bishop to maintain a spatial advantage. So the main move in modern times has become queen a5 check in this position. But at that time, queen a5 check hadn't yet been really discovered or popularized. This was all new. In the 21st century, queen a5 check has been superseded by the move e takes d, actually. But queen a5 check, the move that was popular in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, has even been passed up on now. But at that time, h6 was the first attempt, played here by Bogolyubov. And h6 remains a playable move even to this day, although I think inferior for black. So we'll see an example of how things can go drastically wrong. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. Black gains the bishop pair, but his queen side, this is very important now. This is a danger here in this opening. The queen side remains problematic to develop. And many strong modern-day grandmasters who have played the Blumenfeld have had very bad experiences in this type of position. I've seen 2,600 grandmasters who tried to play the Blumenfeld suffer with their queenside development. And that's why I think that we have to let go of the idea of the variations with queen a5 check. We'll talk about that later. But again, back to this historical game. Knight c3, white develops quickly, b4, and now knight to b5. And we see the problems facing black in this opening now very clearly. The knight on b5 menacing, black's development is lagging, and the problem of getting these pieces out is highlighted in this position. So theory hadn't really been developed here. Bogolyubov basically on his own, or with a few ideas, not enough. Knight to a6 and now e4. This is a common theme, sacrificing this pawn at b2. Here black grabs the pawn, but he doesn't really have a forward plan, and his development is left lagging completely. A very common problem. Bishop to d3, and then what to do with black here. Perhaps something like bishop e7, but black also has to be careful that his queen is about to get trapped in some variations. So he tries to run away with the queen, which is natural, but now his spatial disadvantage is very serious. e5, queen d8, and then d takes e6. This move, which is like normally a kind of positional mistake for white, decisively opens the game here for Grunfeld. Either g6 will become weak, or white will get access to the e4 square and attack the black king from the other diagonal, which is what happens here. He actually allows the trade of queens, which is kind of ironic, but this is the winning mechanism here for white. Bishop e4, and then even after queen takes d1, rook takes d1, only move rook b8, bishop c6 check, a very beautiful win for Grunfeld. It just looks like black's okay for a moment after king e7, but the simple move knight takes a7. And it's not really possible for black to defend this position because the invasion at c6 with the knight here, the knight at c6 will be too disruptive, and this is what happens now. Bogolyubov tries to break out with g5. There's no time. Bishop b5, and now the fatal threat of the knight coming to c6. There's just no way really to get out of this, because it's a fork of the rook and king. It's not enough to free up a flight path for the black king. The rook is trapped as well. The next game is another historical battle from 1922. It was played between the father of Yugoslav or Serbian chess, Kostic, and Geza Marozzi. So this was clearly a regional growth of the Blumenfeld in this whole area of Hungary, what was Yugoslavia, what is Austria, and even Russia and Germany, with the inclusion of Spielmann and players like Alekhine. Clearly the opening was invented in this region. So Kostic against Marozzi. Marozzi will spread this opening to the Hungarian players. At least his influence will spread it to the future Hungarian players. Kostic-Marozzi went down a different path. Now we will see the path from the first game with d takes e6, f takes e6, the accepted variation, c takes b5, d5, e3, following Tarrasch, Alekhine, bishop d6. The exact same moves, and what I consider kind of a passive formation for white. Bishop e2, bishop b7, and now Kostic played the natural castles instead of Tarrasch's b3. Castles, queen e7, queen c2, same placement, knight on bd7, and now bishop to d3. But there's something wrong with white's position. First of all, development of the queen at c2 doesn't seem very significant. The bishop is moving a second time to d3. And now we see another key idea in the setup. Black again making use of the preponderance of pawns in the center. Don't forget that the black c-pawn can lunge forward to c4 here. Kostic inducing it, and it's coming with a valuable tempo, and also giving black a key square. This game is not as beautiful as Alekhine's win against Tarrasch, as the full-blooded attacking game, but Marozzi in control all the way in this game, more of a technical kind of game, but it's, I think, a very eloquent use of black's central majority that we see here by Marozzi, the Hungarian great. So bishop e2, knight c5, gaining that key square for the pieces. And Kostic really just never completing his development here, asking for trouble. Another case of moving the same piece twice. Knight to d4, another suspect move, but he's hoping to blot out the black bishop at b7 with a knight c6 drop. This actually happens in the game. Now Marozzi, with knight on f to e4, opening up his play on the king side. He's looking for direct threats against h2 and play along the f file. Very important, black's counterplay along the f file due to the half-open file made possible by the capture f takes e6 in these accepted variations. This is why I really like I like some of the declined variations with g3, because this attack is not so strong. Knight on f to e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4. Now Kostic, feeling the threats, plays the weakening move f4, but an understandable decision. And then Marozzi trying to open it up again with e5, and white kind of desperately trying to stop black's attack. So knight c6, bishop takes c6, b takes c6. The attack keeps going with e takes f4, and Kostic gives up material in this case, a pawn, to try to slow black's attack. So bishop f3. He has made it to the point where he's traded a lot of pieces, and if we count the material here, it's actually equal at the moment. But developmentally, black is better. And the other factor which is very important, black has maintained the stronger pawn center. These pawns at d5 and c4 dominating the position. White center is kind of in tatters. Bishop c5, focusing on the e3, and that could eliminate what's left of white's center. b4, sacrificing a pawn to try to decoy white. Bishop takes b4, rook b1. Kostic does a good job of keeping black busy so he can't directly attack the white king. Bishop back to c5, now counterplay for white with rook b7. In this game, quite a bit more technical than the last we saw, at least the game Tarash versus Alekhine, but a beautiful temporary or sham sacrifice here of the queen by Marazzi. F takes e3, leaving his queen en prise, allowing the threat of e2, discover check, while promoting in the future for black. This is a beautiful little combination that kind of highlights this game. So something that I think that Kostic didn't really anticipate. Queen e2, queen e6, and now black just wins with technique, basically. Bishop b2 and c3. And so we've seen the victory of the center for black in this game by Marazzi. The central pawns that just simply couldn't be stopped. Bishop takes e4, c takes b2, and Kostic really playing a very cagey game. He survives to an opposite color bishop situation, but can't quite hold on. Bishop f3, queen takes c6, and then rook takes b2. Black emerging victorious really because of the center, the remaining pawns that just weren't captured. And he wins beautifully here. Bishop b6, g3, rook f5, defending the d5 pawn, preparing to double or triple along the f-file. Combining attack and defense, king g2, rook a f8, rook c2, queen e6, queen d3, and then queen f7, tripling on the f-file, devastating. Queen e2, h5, h4, d4, and then the kind of eloquent finish, queen c4 and d3. The white queen simply overloaded. He cannot maintain the pin, therefore stopping rook takes f3, as well as capture at d3. So I thought this is a very beautiful finish, really. I mean, Marazzi winning with those central pawns that define the black side of this accepted version of the Blumenfeld. Finally, to finish our historical perspective here in Chapter 1, I want to show you a game played by Gideon Stalberg. This was in Mar del Plata, 1945. The opening had grown, and there were a lot of games played in Argentina in the 30s and 40s. And Stalberg, the Swedish grandmaster, of course, taking it into post-war Europe and the world. In 1945, it would start to grow, and we'd sort of enter the modern era of the opening, and the thing started to morph into closer to what we would really consider here as our modern Blumenfeld. This is the first evidence of the opening, I think, morphing into its modern form. So Julio Bulbakin against Stalberg, Mar del Plata, 1945, both very strong, relatively modern players. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, c5, d5, and now b5, bishop g5, the anti-Blumenfeld, if you want to call it that. And still, e takes d here has not really been played yet. This is the move that I'm going to recommend later on in the series as our main line. But e takes d, c takes d, and h6. Not quite as refined as our modern variation with d6. But this is the first real evidence of the opening sort of evolving into the modern standard that I would play today. h6 close to the modern line with d6, which would later be explored by Portisch, but we'll talk about it in Chapter 2. So h6, kind of a cross between the old version and the new version. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. Here white defends, Bulbakin defends b2. A little bit time consuming. Queen c2, d6, e4. And now a6. The problem here for black is that his queen is somewhat misplaced on f6. You'd almost rather have the queen back on d8 and be able to play just bishop e7. a4, a strong move. Very key in this variation. And this is why really I think h6 isn't quite as good as the modern e takes d. Now, if we take on a4, it's possible that's better than what happened in the game. I'm not sure, but b4 does cede the c4 square, and this is usually a positional problem of grave ramifications here on c4. That can be a serious issue. White establishes a knight there, attacking the b6 square, the a5 square, the d6 pawn, allowing for an e5 kind of clamp or pawn break. It's very unpleasant. Knight on bd2, bishop g4. This is not really a great position for black, but I think an important historical game where black is getting the right idea here, putting pressure on the white position. We don't really want to give up the bishop, but we might have to maintain control of e5 and d4. And you'll see games, this was played in 1945, you'll see games kind of along these lines up until through the 1980s. Bishop e2, knight to d7, and now knight to c4. This is the key outpost for white. Very important, powerful. So Stalberg was kind of on the edge here, facing threats of e5. He's finding the time for g6, castles, and bishop g7, which is fortunate that white doesn't have sort of tactics with e5 or something like that. Rook on ad1. I think Bulbakken just played a little bit too slowly. Castles, and now h3. And we have to give up this bishop, sadly. Bishop takes f3, and now bishop takes f3, and knight to e5. Knight takes e5, queen takes e5. And actually, this type of ending, very, very common even in many of the modern lines of the Blumenfeld. Opposite color bishops, where black has the dark squared bishop, white has the white squared bishop. Black is a little bit better because his bishop is less blocked by his own pawns, as the white squared bishop is here. In opposite color bishop positions, the initiative is everything. Material doesn't mean that much. Whoever has the better bishop and the more active pieces really has the initiative. King safety is also a factor here. I think it's important to note that Stalberg has the break with f5, which is an important factor. White having difficulty organizing like f4, e5, therefore without play. b3, rook on a to e8, bishop e2, and Stalberg just immediately hammers out f5, hanging his a6 pawn, basically trading it for the central pawn, which was really dynamic. Bishop takes a6, giving white a protected pass pawn on a4, but having faith that his central and kingside threats will outweigh white's counterplay. F takes e5, rook e1, queen f4, and suddenly the white king is in danger of things like bishop to e5, bishop to d4, bishop b5, rook e7, a5, bishop d4, a6. It's kind of a race between the white outside pass pawn and black's threats against the king side. King g7, bishop d3, bishop e5, inducing weaknesses. And white here had miscalculated. g3, e takes d3, g takes f4, and actually a forced sequence which leads to a rook ending, which is winning for black. D takes c2, f takes e5, and then beautiful move, c4. Breaking through. In this case, not the central pawns as in Marazzi's game, but the queenside pawns, more of like a Benko type of thing, where the Benoni or Benko with the queenside pawns were too fast, and black goes on to win. This was Bulbakken against Stalberg from Mar del Plata 1945. So I think we've established a really good historical perspective, how this opening came to exist. The early history of it with Benjamin Blumenfeld, and its Russian history is kind of a mystery. But I think we've established pretty much how it was developed from 1922 onward here till 1945. In part 2, we'll take a look at how it evolves into a modern opening.